Father, again, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this fellowship, and we thank you for your word. We ask that you would pour out your Holy Spirit, a spirit of understanding, spirit of faith, that we would not be conformed to this world, but rather be transformed by the renewing of our minds, that we might be conformed to the image of our Lord Jesus Christ, the last Adam. And we thank you that in him you have made us in his image, and ask that you would, as you have promised, bring to perfection the work that you have begun. I pray that you would guide our conversation this evening, our thoughts, our questions. Help us to understand the world in which we live, that we might better understand how to live in that world. For we ask these things for the edification of the church, for our building up in faith, and for your glory. And we ask in Jesus' name, amen. Trivia quiz for people over 50. Who remembers this theme song? Those were the days. All in the Family. A show that is probably not even legal in syndication anymore. The most politically incorrect show of the 1970s. But it opened up with Archie and Edith singing, both out of key, this song, Those Were the Days. And I mentioned this last week, or perhaps the week before, that we do as Christians, as we do as humans, we do tend to wax nostalgic. And really that it happens at a fairly early age. It's not an old fart disease. It's something that once you get in, at least your 30s, probably even mid to late 20s, you start thinking how the things used to be, the way things used to be. And somehow we always imagine that they were better. But they weren't. But in the church, we don't generally wax nostalgic about our own life. We tend to look back at some era in church history that we seem to think got it right, and wish that were our era, that we would live in 17th century Puritan England, or in the first century, or some other time that we think that they just got it right. They really loved the Lord. They loved one another. It's really a silly notion, because if you read the letters of Paul, especially the two to Corinth, you realize that even having apostles on the scene didn't help. You know, there was a mess. And I mentioned when we talked about this last that if you read the writings of any era, including the patristic era, any time during the Middle Ages, during the Reformation, during the Puritan era, during the Elizabethan or the Victorian era, whatever era, you will hear the preachers lamenting the sorry and lax condition of Christianity in their day. And you'll hear them waxing nostalgic about some previous era when the Spirit burned brighter and believers were more on fire and more dedicated and more devoted. And it's all bunk. It's not truth. It's a false picture of the past. But it's also worse than that. It's a form of escapism. And it's a form of rejecting divine providence, because he has raised us up for just such a time as now. How do we know that? Because we're alive now. And we weren't alive then, and we won't be alive in 100 years. Okay? When our descendants will wax nostalgic over our era. Okay? So the idea, those were the days, is it's kind of common to the human condition. We seem to have an aversion to the present. The time in which we live is always the worst possible time. And it happens even, in the course of our life. We hear people talk about how bad it is. People who ought to know better, people who lived through the 70s. They ought to know better. That we have a much better living standard, much cleaner air, much cleaner water, much better food. Just about everything is far better than in my parents' or grandparents' time. In the church, we lament how awful it is, how biblical literacy is at an all-time low. But biblical literacy was always at an all-time low not because people can't read or couldn't read, but because people don't care. The church has always been populated by probably a majority of those who really don't show any interest in their faith. That causes almost an existential problem every generation of the church. How can people who don't care about the Bible, how can they actually be saved? Have you ever wondered that? I mean, how can all the people that profess to be Christian in the United States really be Christian and the United States be the way it is? Well, we don't know. Only God knows. All we can do is as Jesus said to Peter in respect to John, and that is, what does it matter to you whether he lives or dies? You follow me. Okay, we can't consider the past, and we can't consider really the condition of the present. But I mentioned last week the sons of Issachar, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but just a passage in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 32. And of the sons of Issachar, men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do, their chiefs were 200 and their kinsmen at their command. Okay? Men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. There is no elaboration on that I can find, before or after. It's not said, in fact, commentary is not given on the other tribes, just Issachar. And Issachar is not one of the major tribes. Okay? When you are, Sunday school and you're asked to recite the 12 tribes, you probably get Judah, I hope, and maybe Reuben and Levi. You got to get Levi, or maybe Ephraim and Manasseh because they were twins. But then you get down into the sons of the concubines, or the maidservants, whatever you called them back then. But you get down into Zebulun and Issachar and Asher and Dan, and you think Asher and Donner and Blitzen, and you know how it goes. All right, it's all happened to you too. You're pulling an Israelite sleigh after a while. So here's Issachar, men who understood the time and knew what Israel should do. So what does that mean? Does that mean that Issachar was always blessed throughout its generations with insight into the times and knowledge as to what Israel should do? No, it doesn't mean that at all. In fact, Issachar was one of the tribes that abandoned the dynasty of David and joined with the rebellious 10 tribes and was carried off into Assyrian exile and basically lost. Except for those members of Issachar, as with all of the 10 tribes, that after Jeroboam set up the 2 golden calves in the north, they said no way, and they migrated down to Judah. So that within Judah, all 12 tribes were represented, but clearly Issachar did not understand the times at that time. So what does this phrase mean? It doesn't mean universal wisdom that we pass down from generation to generation. But what it has to mean, even though we don't have any context or explanation, it has to mean that they understood their times. And because it wasn't their condition throughout their generations, I think we can surmise that the times that they understood at that time also didn't remain uniform and consistent as time went on. Times change. But Scripture doesn't. And one of the problems with the nostalgia that I was mentioning is that we want to apply the Scriptures the way they were applied in 17th century England, or during the Dutch Reformation, or in Geneva under Calvin. Okay? We pick a time when we think, this is what I mean by they got it right, that they applied the Scriptures to their time in a way that worked. Now, what that means is subject to debate. But John Knox, whom I rarely quote, and will rarely quote, but he considered Geneva to be a perfect school of Christ. Okay? There were many in Geneva who didn't think that it was, thought that it was pretty rigid and lacking in grace. But Knox thought that it was a perfect school of Christ. So, okay, let's imitate Geneva. And that has been done, or attempted many, many times in the Reformed tradition. Now, I think the situation of recognizing that God's providence is sovereign, which means that the church in any age is only meant for the age in which they live. That means that their interpretation and application of the timeless Scripture must understand the time in which they live. That make sense? Now, I know that can also raise hackles, because it sounds like we're going to modify the Scripture to meet the time in which we live. But that is not what I'm advocating. In fact, by calling Scripture timeless, God said, or the psalmist said, "Thy word, O Lord, is settled in heaven." It is unchangeable. Its meaning is also unchangeable. Its purpose is unchangeable. But that does not mean that the application of those unchangeable truths do not have to meet different contingencies in every generation. They do. One of the problems that I have with confessionalism is the attempt to apply answers and solutions to problems that are no longer facing our society. If you read behind the confessions, you read the history of the confessions, you realize that they were hammered out in unique ecclesiastical and also political environments. And those who wrote those confessions were self-consciously addressing particular issues and questions. Same is true with using commentaries. That commentaries tend to be in the culture in which they are written. And they're going to address, for example, we're going to talk in our class at some point about this whole idea of wokeness and whatnot. That would not have been in this class even 5 years ago, and hopefully will not in 5 years' time. But you find things in the commentaries that are clearly, I don't know what that's all about. There's something going on, some controversy within the church, some teaching that is being held in anathema that I've never heard of and is no longer taught. So context, or historical context, is unavoidable. And the form of our interpretation and application of Scripture will always be, to some extent, and I think a large extent, determined by the context of our culture and our time. Jenny?
You notice that even though Jesus' message was uniform, the way he addressed different people would change because he knew the hearts of men.
Right. He did not address every single group within society the same way. In fact, it was noted that he was a friend to sinners, publicans, and prostitutes, but he came down pretty hard on the scribes and the Pharisees. That's kind of a case in point, although certainly he was applying, and this was part of the controversy of his life, he was applying the teaching of Scripture in a way that had not been applied for two reasons. One, who he was, but two, when he was. That the time in which he lived, the time of visitation, was unique. But the time of Isaiah was unique, and the time of Micah, and the time of post-exilic Haggai and Zechariah. These were unique times, and even the prophecies seemed to take that into account, what they were facing, and certainly the history of what they were facing. So I'm not saying that in any way we modify what the Word says. In fact, that would be just essentially ecclesiastical suicide. That's what the church has been doing, has done throughout its ages, and that is to acclimate or acculturate its message to the world around. What I am saying is, like the sons of Issachar, we ought to understand the times in which we live. And oftentimes we spend so much time lamenting the times gone by that we never really stop to realize what kind of a world God placed us in. And we ask the question, the church in the world, what is the church to be in the world? Well, it's not supposed to be pining for some past era, but rather it should be, as the sons of Issachar, understanding the times and knowing what Israel should do. Understanding the world in which we live, and from that and the wisdom that we ask of God, understanding what the church should do. Now, when we do that, we do find this French phrase that one of the few things I remember in French, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This is a French commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes. Okay? Nothing new under the sun. And so you'll see in the notes as I talk about the modern philosophical framework, which we call now postmodernism, stemming, we're going to talk about that tonight, stemming from the Enlightenment of the 18th century. I also say that Paul encountered these things too. Our culture is often called pluralist, meaning we have a lot of different ethnicities, religions, cultural traditions and mores, all jumbled up in one society. In the United States is called a melting pot, but really we haven't turned into a soup, a homogeneous. It's more like a stew, where we have clumps of cultural uniqueness all within the same society, oftentimes within the same neighborhood now. Okay, so, but that's not different than the first century Roman Empire. That's certainly not different than the city of Corinth, which was a commercial harbor and was polyglot. It was multi-ethnic, and so so was Rome. Okay. So Paul lived in a pluralist world. He also lived in a world that was almost uniformly theistic, polytheistic, pantheistic, monotheistic. But this is one place where our age differs significantly from Paul's and any other age up to the 19th century. And that is, for most of human history, the word atheism was a capital crime. It was not used because nobody was an atheist. You were a theist of some sort. But the idea that human society could live without acknowledgement of the gods just never came into anybody, or generally speaking, never came into anybody's mind. The closest were the Epicureans, but all they really did was kind of a hyper-deist, moving the gods so far away from man that it was an effective atheism, but they still acknowledged the gods because social pressure demanded some form of theism to hold society together. We don't have that anymore. It is not only permissible, it's even, in many cases, admirable to be an atheist. And we're entering into a generation where there's a certain, first of all, pride of being an atheist, but also it's becoming a reality. There were those who denied the existence of God or of the gods, but what they were really saying was they were denying the immanence of any gods. They were denying the influence of any gods within the world of human society, within the world around us. And that's really how the Enlightenment took it. Men like Voltaire and John Locke and Thomas Jefferson They didn't actually deny the existence of God or of heaven. They simply believed that God did not participate in the affairs of men. That was Epicureanism. So even in the most godless of the ancient philosophies, they were still gods. They're just way out there. Okay, so it's an effective atheism, yes. But now we have the real thing. We have true, bona fide, philosophical, epistemological atheism.
Can you really call them atheists because they have idols all over the place, like science?
They don't recognize anything as sovereign.
But do they have to?
Yes, to be a theist, you have to recognize that sovereignty and the power and the otherness. What is science? Science is human rationality. And yes, they have exalted rationality. I'm calling them atheists because that's what the word means. God calls them fools. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Okay? So, I don't want to quibble over the terms. Is there ever such a thing as an atheist? Well, no. God has set eternity in the heart of every man, right? But it also speaks of consciences being seared. And I think we've entered into a realm of Western civilization where a large part of our society is truly desensorized, cauterized to the notion of divine beings. Yes, they have to have something, money, science, something's in its place. Something will fill that vacuum. But that which fills that vacuum will be in their own minds themselves and their own understanding, their own reason. Now, it's not. They're following, like lambs to the slaughter, the latest scientific or money-making fad. Okay, we're all independent, but we're independent together. Okay, so yeah, we can argue over the meaning of that word, but what it essentially means is a denial of the divine, of the otherness of the divine, something that no human society, regardless of how powerful or civilized we would account it, ever did. One writer says that what modern Western society is attempting something that has never been attempted before, and that is to rebuild human society without a God. Archaeologists, anthropologists, sociologists, we've never found anything quite like that. We may not agree or even understand the divinities or the deities, but after a while, in studying their documents and whatnot, we realized that they had a recognizable theism, a hierarchy, okay, a role, interaction between man and the gods. That's what's being Christianity, religion itself, but primarily Christianity, because it's taken place mostly in Western Europe and the United States and Canada. Christianity has been privatized. It has been personalized. It is what it means to you. And that, in fact, is a direct descendant, a direct heir of the whole zeitgeist, the whole philosophy of the Enlightenment. So we're going to talk about how do we get to where we are in trying to understand the world in which we live. So our period is called postmodernism. So there'll be a lot of isms tonight. Now, I mentioned this last week, and this term is largely undefined and undefinable. And yet that's part of its definition. We're going to see that the results of the Enlightenment of the 18th century through the other phenomena that took place primarily in the 18th century, the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, Scientific Revolution, the rise of evolution and that teaching has shattered and atomized standard human thought to the point where there can be no longer any word that really characterizes even a large minority of human society. So we can't say, oh, they're Platonists, or they're Epicurean, or they're Stoic, or they're Aristotelian. We can't use those labels anymore because they don't apply. Even within a single individual now, you can't really discern their philosophy of life. What do they think holds the universe together? And this derives directly from the teaching of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is called the Age of Reason. And it runs from about the middle of the 17th century. Some people put it from 1648, which was the end of the 30 Years' War, but also it was the major treatise, philosophical treatise of René Descartes. And then 1781, when Immanuel Kant published his Critique of Pure Reason. So about 150 years of intense philosophical musings and writings, a time that included, as I mentioned, included Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, Diderot, it included Jean-Jacques Rousseau, David Hume, who was probably one of the first to actually proclaim himself to be an atheist. So a number of philosophers who were emphasizing the uniqueness and the exaltation of human reason, and we greatly benefited from them because what they were writing was a direct attack on the divine right of kings. So these are the men whose influence motivated our founding fathers, who read deeply in John Locke and in Rousseau and in Voltaire. In fact, they were alive at the same time, and some of them actually met, Franklin and Voltaire. They read deeply into these philosophers from the European continent, and those thoughts drove the rebellion against not just England, not just King George, but monarchy. Okay? You read the writings of Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and Washington. You read the writings of these men, and you realize, yeah, the Stamp Act, the tea, whatever. These were really just little matches that started a fire that was already smoldering. And why many Americans applauded the French Revolution was they saw this as the logical extension of the American Revolution, and were looking for the putting off of all monarchs everywhere. So this entire paradigm shift is going on, and we've benefited greatly in our country. We have a freedom that was inconceivable at the time and is still inconceivable to the vast majority of the human race. Okay? So yeah, we can look back on this and say, thank you very much. But it had a cost. It had a cost to the cohesiveness of society. It also had a cost in terms of the relationship of the church within society. In the 18th century, the church was still very much part of society, but by that time it had already been essentially co-opted by the political aspect of society. And many of those who pushed strongest and earliest for breaking with Great Britain were themselves preachers. And they were using the pulpit to preach the revolution. And they were also readers of these philosophes, these Enlightenment thinkers. So the Age of Reason, David Wells has an interesting book. I mentioned it last week. And I do No Place for Truth. But he says, from an intellectual point of view, the modern world began with the Enlightenment. With that project aimed at accounting for the whole of life strictly within the bounds of natural reason. That's kind of a nutshell of the operating principle of the Enlightenment. And that is, as we look out into the world and as we look into ourselves, as we read our Bibles or our newspapers, we subject everything to reason, to the human mind. So what we have in the A's of reason now, going back to the atheism, did man make his mind a god? Yes. But the mind of man can never be a god. And no man actually bowed down at an altar to worship his own mind. So the vacuum had to be filled with something. So as man removed God, that vacuum was filled with human rationality, human reason. So that is kind of the essence of the Enlightenment. And really, in and of itself, it is historically, it's the final resolution of a question that had been troubling theologians for ages and philosophers even before that, but especially Christian theologians. And this is the final resolution of the faith versus reason. Dichotomy. Aquinas dealt with it. Earlier, Anselm dealt with it. Anselm said, I believe in order that I might understand. Aquinas tried to bring reason and faith together in a synthesis. What was actually happening is reason was taking over. And the more we thought we understood the world, and you see this even now that, the movies about the Coca-Cola bottle that falls out of an airplane, and the natives think it's a god. The stereotypical view of the ancients as if they were superstitious bumpkins. Okay? And didn't understand. When Jesus himself said, you understand the times and the seasons. They were very scientific. They determined the circumference of the globe. They weren't idiots. They built the pyramids. Okay? So our ancestors were not all ignorant cavemen. Just because they were pagan and polytheistic does not mean they were not, in their own time and way, very scientific, very technical. But to them, the idea of a divorce between the gods and human society was simply inconceivable. The idea that you could have a separation of church and state, no one ever thunk that before. Okay? Because the king was the representative of God on earth, the gods. Okay? In fact, some name of a god is usually in the name of the king. And his coronation day was a religious holiday. So, and then there was always a priesthood. So there was always an intimate relationship between the religion of the people and the people's life, their political life, their social life, their family life. Well, that started to be disassembled in the 18th century, even more so in the 19th century, and then cataclysmically in the 20th. The 20th century is a remarkable century filled with more dead from famine, disease, pestilence, war, and all other things that mankind brought about than any other century. In fact, I've read more people died in the 20th century on account of war than all previous centuries combined. Okay. That has to have an effect on the world in which we live. Certainly it's had an effect on Europe. Maybe not so much an effect on the United States, but we are Europe's descendants for the most part. And what starts in Europe will eventually cross the Atlantic, including the Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th and 18th century. Their writings cross the Atlantic, and then they're soaked up by Americans. So this idea that we resolve this by saying this is primary, and this, you might quote John the Baptist. Faith must decrease, that reason might increase. Okay?
Could you replace reason with observation? Because by saying that this was the age of reason, I mean, the idea behind that is that everything that came before was unreason. But there was an incredible amount of logic to every worldview system that came before. So it seems like what they're exalting is not the human processes of logic, because even saying that, the king is the representative of God is totally reasonable and logical. But the Enlightenment system is based on reasoning from observation.
Well, not exactly, but very close. You're doing what I'm about to do, and that is there were other epistemological phenomenon going on. What you read in Voltaire is not really based on the empirical method. It is still philosophy. In fact, the Enlightenment philosophers were themselves heirs of the Reformation. And the liberty that the Reformation brought to each individual from the church itself brought in the rebellion of those very same children against God. So in the Reformation, European man was told, you can think for yourself. And that's what they did. And when you think for yourself, you do realize, at least they did, and they encourage one another, so it's kind of a movement that feeds off of itself as it goes, but they're reasoning that there is nothing from mere birth that sets one man above another. And that if you trace, and this is mere history, if you trace the lineage of the aristocracy, you find that they usually began their time in the sun by murder and pillage of some unprotected and unsuspecting land that they were strong enough to take over, killing whatever tribal leaders were there, and becoming themselves the elite. That's how it all started. And you just read history. How did the emperors go from one to another? Well, one killed the one and he became emperor. Same with the kings. Okay? We have the War of the Roses. We have the Norman Conquest. We have men who are called the descendant of God or the representative of God who gained that position by killing other men. And this is what the philosophers said, this isn't right. You're just the heirs of murderers or brigands, okay? There's nothing special about you, okay? And then, of course, they had the history. They're coming pretty much right after the 30 Years' War, which for that time was like World War I in the 20th century. It was a war of utter devastation and no real solution or resolution, okay? And it lasted 30 years. And Germany itself was just absolutely almost annihilated. Okay? They had plagues. They had, so they had quite a bit of reason to question the status quo. But they didn't necessarily do it by scientific observation. But what comes along at about the same time is the scientific revolution. Francis Bacon. Okay? The idea of the empirical method. And this just dovetails with the philosophy of the Enlightenment. The philosophy of the Enlightenment says that the repository of knowledge is right up here in the human brain, in our mind. Now that is an immediate attack on the concept of revelation. Okay, so when we're talking about the rise of reason, faith must decrease. So what we're talking about is rational versus revelational. That we figure things out with our minds. But again, the philosophers were still philosophers. And much of what they wrote would read a lot like Plato or Aristotle or Augustine, Christian philosophers or pagan philosophers. But at the same time, we have a revolution going on in science. And science is moving from what once was called natural philosophy. Now, science is just the Latin for knowledge, scientia. Okay? So the idea of science is just that. It's gaining knowledge of the world and the universe around us.
Isn't that some of the reason we have what's so proudly called often liberal art schools? So now you have liberalized the original purpose for college, teaching theology and so forth. So now you have liberal and a lot of other things.
Well, liberal in the original meaning of the word. Now, liberal is pejorative, okay, but liberal, I think it's from the same liber. It's from the same root as liberty. And liberal arts was actually a good thing because it opened up education to a vaster, wider segment of society. I think the reason we have liberal arts colleges now may be a reaction to the materialism of the science schools. We started out in the liberal arts because that's really all there was. We didn't really have an objective thing that we now call science. Science was a branch of philosophy called natural philosophy. And the way science was done up until about the time of Francis Bacon, the 16th century, right? 16th century? Is you would develop your theories of how nature works based on your philosophy of how the universe works. So your metaphysic dictated your physics. And so that is a very subjective way of doing science. Now what that means is, I use this example in teaching chemistry. You've got I'm teaching chemistry, not art, as you can see. Okay, so you've got whatever it is you're studying in the microscope here. That's a microscope. All right, looks like a plant. Okay, looks like an apple. This is where faith comes in. So you have the scientist and you have the object of his study. Now, in natural philosophy, the direction of discovery came, first of all, from the subject, the scientist. And his observation of nature was powerfully dictated by his philosophy of nature. It's one of the reasons why, for so long, we thought that the sun went around the earth. Now, actual observation would show, at least with the planets, that they go up and they go back. See, retrograde movements of the planets has always been there, right? So if something's going around you, then it goes around you, right? It goes through the sky, but the planets don't do that. Okay? The moon does, but then it changes shape and, Observation would have probably led to a heliocentric planetary system much sooner than it did, but it couldn't, because the philosophy that governed didn't allow it. The word atom, which means undestroyable, okay? It means it's the smallest possible thing, was coined by Democritus, a Greek philosopher in the 4th century before Christ, in the 300s. It was picked up again in the 1st century by Lucretius, and wasn't picked up again until John Dalton in the 18th century, because the zeitgeist did not allow it. The concept of the universe being made up of particles that we can't see was ludicrous. We knew that the universe was made up of earth and water and fire and air, and the combinations of them, right? Okay, so that even went into the medical terminology, the 4 humors. So we had this order, this numerology. They were the 4 points of the compass. See, everything was organized, and then everything was analyzed through that organization. That's natural philosophy. Does that make sense? And we've come to realize that it's not right. Now, what is amazing is what they accomplished through this. That they weren't bumbling idiots stumbling in the dark. Again, they built the pyramids with this kind of wrong, subjective, natural philosophy, but they're also created in the image of God. So even though they have fallen, their philosophy is not totally off the mark.
Now you can jump into hermeneutics.
Now, well, yeah, I could, but not yet, not yet. We're going to take it slow. So, the scientific revolution basically changes the direction of the arrow and says that knowledge comes from the object, not from the subject. Now, we've never been able to 100% attain objectivity. We all have predispositions, preconceptions, presuppositions that we probably don't even recognize, making it impossible for us to see some things, at least for generations. And so things have been discovered that the discovery of which is not really understood for another 2 or 3 generations or 1 or 2 generations. Okay, so we're never going to attain a completely objective world, okay? Not even in our computers, because they're programmed by human beings. But the idea of the scientific revolution is observation. Not coming to something with a preconceived notion of how the universe is constructed, but by observing how the universe... Now again, they were doing the same thing, but their philosophy determined their theory. Now, the same thing is happening today with the philosophy of evolution. You have that philosophy, and so everything you see fits in, is interpreted by that mindset. So we're not really at all that different in age, but when we couple it with the Enlightenment, we are further exalting human reason. Now, on top of this, so we add to the age of reason the scientific revolution. And we can talk about it today as a scientific revolution, but it was a very long revolution. It didn't happen overnight. The famous story of the physician who, when he took over, I think, of head of surgery of some Eastern European hospital, one of the first things he did was mandated that the physicians and the nurses wash their hands. And all of a sudden, the incredibly high, disgustingly high mortality rate among the patients dropped. Now, they didn't quite understand germ theory, but I think it was about the time of Louis Pasteur. Lister, weren't they 19th century? But he got fired. Okay, what he was doing was considered anathema to the rest of the medical community. He was fired and lost his position. See, it wasn't immediately accepted. Look at this, patients aren't dying. This must be good. No, they fired him. Okay, so they treat science today as if science has proven. No, science has never proven anything and is constantly disproving itself. So we have to understand the times and not fall into the traps that are set for us. But nonetheless, the scientific revolution, looking back on it, we see an amazing development in human understanding of nature, and not only understanding, but manipulation of nature. So, for example, we can take the advances made by the ancients in herbal medicine, and then we can now synthesize the key ingredients in our pharmacology sciences. Okay? So we can take germ theory and we can take DNA and we can clone, and the advancement in scientific knowledge has just been phenomenal over the past 200 years. Enough to call it a revolution. The same thing is true. So what this does is this elevates human reason over nature. It gives man a sense of epistemological destiny, and superiority. That we can, it is amazing. I don't know how many of you have ever read Eric Larson's Isaac's Storm. It's about the 1900 or 1908, I can never remember the date, but the Galveston hurricane. And just absolutely devastating. A hurricane that Galveston has never recovered. Galveston was actually larger than Houston and was really in a position to put Houston in the dust in terms of commercial growth. After the hurricane, Houston became the major city of Texas and not Galveston. But we didn't know it was coming. They didn't know it was coming. Now, had they not been so prejudiced, and had they listened to the Cuban meteorologists, I mean, you read this story, I'm giving away some of the punchline, but having dealt with so many more hurricanes, the Cubans had developed a natural predictive system, the behavior of animals, for example, of tides, things like that. They didn't have radar, but now we have Doppler radar. Now we can not only see a hurricane, we have satellites, we have aircraft, we can see a hurricane forming in the Atlantic, and now we have computer models that tell us where it might go. Okay? So, yeah, we've benefited a lot from the advancements of science. Adding to this, and this is kind of the stepdaughter, or at least the daughter of the scientific revolution, is the industrial. The steam engine, chemistry, and the advances, especially in Germany, of chemical fertilizers. Tim.
Just predating the Industrial Revolution briefly, one quote, one figure that kind of combines all these together. Quotation Diderot, the French editor of the Encyclopedia, which was his exaltation of human knowledge, of all technology, everything that humans can do, saw himself as an atheist. We don't need God in any of this. But he has the embodiment of his philosophy about mankind will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Right.
The last king is strangled from the entrails of the last priest. So this is like the French Revolution. Yeah. And that goes back to what Yuri commented. We're never without a God. And reason became the God, although reason can never be a God because it's our own reason. But the monarchs, the monarchs and the priesthood, they were the enemies of the French Revolution. They were, to a large extent, if you read the writings of our founding fathers, they were very much against kings and priests and would have essentially the same attitude as Diderot as to what to do with them. Okay? And some of them, like Thomas Jefferson, were very explicit as to what he would do with every last king and every last priest. So, because the king ruled by diktat and the priest ruled by manipulation and lies. They were enemies of the truth, and they were oppressors of all mankind. And you think about it, and it's like, yeah, they pretty much have been. And not just Christian, not just European, but if you look at the cultures of antiquity, the emperors and the priests were the dominant classes of every society, and every society was kept underfoot and under thumb by these two classes.
But now scientists are our priests.
Well, now scientists are our priests, and science is our new religion, yes. And whatever a scientist says is as if revelation. So yes, we're not, again, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Nonetheless, we do have the unique distinction of being the only society in the history of mankind that is attempting to build itself without any reference to God or gods. That is especially important because we recognize all men to be created in the image of God. So it's not just some arbitrary development of philosophy. It is almost the ultimate stage of human rebellion against God. It was one thing to falsify God. It is another thing to annihilate him. And that has been the effort of the modern West. Now, when I say, I'm only talking about our culture, the Western world. This is not the case everywhere in the world. Yuri.
I don't want to sound like a heretic, but in our age, we have the option to go to church or not go to church. I'm talking,
Right.
Just general.
Right.
Anyone. But any other time, they have to go to a place of worship that
Mhm.
the monarch or whoever, or the priest, whoever led the community, you had to go to church. So would you rather have the option to come to this church or have to go to some like high liturgy church that you were actually dragged to that you didn't believe,
Well,
or anyone else didn't believe?
I am not advocating for a moment a return to the pre-Enlightenment world. I am not. I've already said we have gained much through the writings of these men, through the work of the founders of our country, the framers of the Constitution. They were very unique men. Very few of them, if any, were evangelical Christians. Most of them were at best deists. Okay? But nonetheless, I applaud their intellect, their bravery, and I'm very thankful for the results. Now, my heritage, Sicily, well, Sicily has a heritage of always being owned by someone. Okay? Now, there was a time when the southern half of Italy and Sicily was called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. That was its day in the sun, before it was overrun by the Normans and the French or whoever, the Germans then. But the idea of oppression is universal. Okay? And all of us, probably, most of us at least, can trace our heritage to, and I'm going to say the Mediterranean world, because we do have the Egyptian, but they had the Greeks, then the Romans, before that the Pharaohs, of course. So they're in the Middle Eastern world and Northeast Africa, their history is quite similar to much of Europe's. And that is the majority of the people oppressed by the minority of the rulers and the priests. So I'm not advocating that we go back to that for one moment. However, I guess what I'm saying is, number one, to be sons of Issachar, we need to understand the time in which we live. And number two, we need to understand, especially as Americans, that all that we've gained came at a cost. That's something that we don't even like as Americans to talk about. How much does something cost? Or how much did it cost? Oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Okay? We're free. We have a great standard of living. We have a wonderful country. The Orioles are winning. I mean, it's like, well, we paid a price for all of this. And not understanding that we paid that price or what that price was that we paid leads us to recognize the ills of our society, but we're powerless to explain why or what to do about them. And the Industrial Revolution, which is, as I said, I think is a direct descendant of the scientific revolution. Within the sciences, you have the theoretical and the practical. When I went to college, the only high school class that I really enjoyed was chemistry. It had more to do with the teacher probably than anything, but I really enjoyed chemistry. So I went to college thinking that I would be a doctor, because that's what you did. You get a chemistry degree and you go to med school, but hospitals made me sick. So, and I would never have been a good doctor. But also the idea of staying in a laboratory day in and day out, doing the same experiment over and over again. I was the poster child for ADHD before it was cool. I remember having a 7th grade math teacher who told me to go outside and chase myself. I still have a tremendous amount of nervous energy. So somebody told me about something I never knew of before. Engineering. Engineering is just a practical application of the theoretical science. So instead of a chemist, I became a chemical engineer, okay, which allowed me to get outside and go to the factory and, do those things. So here's the theoretical, here's the practical. Applying what we're learning through objective science to make our life more productive, more efficient. But the problem with this is that while it increased our standard of living, it elevated, well, I'll get to that in a moment. The main problem of the Industrial Revolution, and it was probably not necessarily foreseen, but prior to the Industrial Revolution, everything that a village needed was made pretty much in the village. Now, by necessity, that meant the village didn't need much. It didn't need much because it couldn't get much. Therefore, it didn't need what it didn't know about. Then we realized, and Adam Smith was kind of just recording in his Wealth of Nations what he had observed. He realized that if you put a machine, a water wheel, you can now draw metal and cut pins at the rate of 10 to 20,000 a day with only 12 workers. Whereas at home, the seamstress having to cut his own or her own, the tailor or whatever, could make maybe 50 or 100. And he couldn't make any more because he had so many other things he needed to be doing. So the idea of the greatest benefit, what can you do that you can do well? Comparative advantage is what it was called. Well, it did two things. First of all, it led to urbanization. Taking people out of the country and off the farm. Now, this is going to continue as the Industrial Revolution grows. It's now providing equipment like the cotton gin and the reaper, the McCormick reaper. It's now providing, it's going to provide with the internal combustion engine, it's going to provide tractors. So now more can be done by fewer people, which means more people don't have jobs. So they go to the cities to work in the factories. And the cities become huge. These huge, highly dense communities of humanity, frequently from vastly different heritage, ethnicities, religions, all pulled together into one region, causing a phenomenon that was only known in places like Rome or maybe London. Any country, there were countries who didn't have any big cities. But the leading countries would have maybe one, maybe two. And the rest of them were just villages where everybody knew everybody, everybody was the same family, same religion, very homogeneous and very stable. Well, no one ever used that word in describing any city in history. Cities are not stable. By nature, they are unstable. They are volatile. So that becomes now a progressively or increasingly major part of Western human culture is the city. Now, if you were to look at a population density map of the United States, you would see that the vast majority of our population lives in a narrow strip of land from Washington up to Boston and from Los Angeles, or San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco. They're just incredibly dense. Then around Chicago, you got another really dense conglomeration of people. And then the rest of the country is just kind of spread out. And the further west you go into the Midwest, you know, there's sometimes miles between neighbors. And the towns you drive through, you blink, you miss it, you know. Okay, that's the way every place used to be. So the Industrial Revolution has that effect of breaking up families and creating a need for fellowship, community, intimacy that is not met in a natural, time-honored, traditional way. Okay? If you have the money, then that need is going to be met by your country club, okay? By your dinner party, dinner societies. If you don't have enough money, it might be met by the bar. Okay? It's going to be met. But it's a false fellowship, a false community, and it's predicated on falsehoods and not truth. Now, this is a reality that actually presents a tremendous opportunity for the gospel and for the church, but we don't recognize it. We don't recognize what has happened to humanity because of these things that have provided us with such incredible benefits in our lives. But what this does is these two things together, but especially this one, gives us two new, primary criteria of life: progress and efficiency. These become the yardsticks. Progress is our hope, and efficiency is how we get there at the greatest profit. Okay? And this, again, the concept of utilitarianism, attributed to the British political philosopher Jeremy Bentham, the idea that something is valued on the basis of its usefulness. Okay? That leads into the church's modern evangelistic paradigm, and that is, if it works, do it. The same thing is true of how we order our worship. What draws the most people in? Ends are justified by the means. Okay? So we value progress and efficiency. We have it in our mind, and we get this every few generations, and then it gets blown apart. And that is this idea of natural human progress. This was the 19th century up until the Great War, World War I. Okay? The 20th century didn't give us much hope for progress, but then the Soviet Union fell. And we fall right back into this idea that democracy and liberty and freedom is going to overflow the world as the waters cover the sea, and the United States is going to be the preacher, the missionary. Well, that didn't work. Okay, 9/11 kind of brought that down. Okay? But we do have this, especially in the West and especially in the United States, we have this almost innate optimism and trust that whatever represents progress is good. And by making things more efficient, we progress faster. And it benefits more people. Well, it is true that economically, many more have benefited by the prosperity of the last 150 years than in any other period in human history. But there's also the nagging reality that much of modern Western economy is smoke and mirrors. That there is an incredible amount of debt, a debt that vastly outnumbers the real value of the property held by companies and individuals, states and nations. But as long as we keep admiring the emperor's clothes, the party just keeps on playing. But if history teaches us anything, there is a time when the party ends. We are naive to think that we are in some type of irreversible upward progression. Okay. But that we'll get into that. But that's part of the zeitgeist, the spirit of our age, in the United States especially, but this idea of ultimate victory over nature. We think we will eradicate diseases, we will eradicate poverty. We look at the condition of mankind and we think that if we pull our science together and put enough money in it, we will eradicate this as a problem. It is amazing that no one in politics has talked about eradicating death. What they basically do is try to legislate it away through OSHA, through the FDA, through all sorts of different laws and regulations, protecting ourselves from ourselves, but we all still die. They can't eradicate that. But that's that idea of progress, progress, progress. So, what we end up with is actually a world that is often termed neo-pagan. And the idea of that is that we adjust our world and life view. We adjust our philosophy of life on the basis of the phenomenon we encounter. Just as the ancients would develop their theology, it really wasn't, but their idea of the gods was derived from their understanding of the natural world around them. Now, science has given us a more intricate knowledge of that natural world, and so it has become, as Abigail mentioned, that it has become the modern priesthood. What does science tell us about this? We, just like our forebears, just like the ancients, follow along. We just do what science tells us. We do what makes for greatest efficiency. We do what we think. We elect those that we think will make our life better than it was last year. Always upward, always progressing. That's the American spirit. Okay. Add to this now, or maybe out of this, elevation of human reason, scientific revolution, which focuses now on the object of our study, nature, the material elements of the universe. And then the evident success that we've had in overcoming nature, both in the theoretical as well as the practical elements. We have made tremendous strides in subduing the earth. If you just look at agriculture, for example, fewer acres are farmed now than ever before in our history, and yet we produce more food. Because of what? Fertilizers. Genetic modification of plant seeds so that corn, wheat, whatever, they have more grain, more heads. Okay? Vegetable farms that are what do they call it, hydroponic or whatever, they're planted and basically you can grow them anywhere now. Okay? We turn deserts into agricultural wonderlands through irrigation. And we also develop, through genetics, we develop drought-tolerant plants so that we don't have to water them as much. So these advancements have managed to, we say we're going to have a war on poverty. Poverty is still with us, but it is nothing like even 100, 150 years ago. In the United States, there is a poverty line that is above the income level of 2/3 of the nations of the world. Our poverty level is above their per capita income level of 2/3 of the nations of the world. And in the United States, there are very, 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 very few people who are living on the brink of starvation, as the vast majority of people did throughout the ancient world and the medieval world and the early modern period. That one crop failure, 1 year's failure, could lead to literal famine and starvation. So yeah, it's all good. The quality of our food, the quantity of our food, the quality of our technology, the affordability of all of this is just, it's absolutely remarkable when viewed in the light of history. We now are able to do and possess things that only the wealthiest were allowed to do 50 and 100 years ago. We can travel to places that our grandparents would have never conceived of going, except in their dreams or books. Okay, that's all great. What did we give up? Well, we gave up the community, and we gave up the unity within our cultural mind of our human society and our society with God. When we moved together into the cities, it became fairly apparent, though not necessarily consciously, but over generations, it became apparent that if each segment of that conglomeration maintained strictly its ethnic and religious identity, there would be warfare in the streets. And there was. Riots, okay, in New York, in Boston, in Baltimore, in Detroit, Chicago. Normally, they were between different discrete ethnic groups. For example, my heritage, at least in New York, it was usually between the Italians and the Poles. They were vying for the same jobs because they emigrated at roughly the same time. They were all despised by the Irish. Okay, so there was all of that. Well, you know what? A society can only do that so long. And after a while, even in Ireland, for example, even in the Middle East, after a while, Arabs begin to intermarry with the Jews. Irish Catholics with Irish Protestants. The Lutheran marries an Italian. My father, my mother. Okay? His family disowned him. His aunts and uncles did not speak to him for the rest of their lives because he married an Italian. All right? But then his children, we didn't even ask. Okay? It wasn't even an issue. It's not even an issue for most Americans now. How do we survive in this pluralistic? Well, by each one of us giving up whatever it was that held our society together for generation after generation after generation. But in doing that, we give up identity, or at least that which was our identity for many generations. Does that make sense? You know, we were identified by that insular community that was our cradle, and our father's cradle and grave, our grandfather's cradle and grave, and now how many families are still living within 50 miles of each other? Okay? They're spread out all over the country, often to the cities.
Here's a great example. I've been in America for 30 years, and I still watch what's going on over there. And the hot button issue in Ukraine is we're not going to speak Russian anymore because we don't want to speak the language of the enemy. And I'm like, who cares? Just speak to the person, whatever language they speak.
But they're in the middle of it, you know, and so that's a reaction. But what I'm saying is that all of these forces have caused, this is what we've paid. We have given up the glue that has held together human society in all different manifestations of it for millennia. And now we bind ourselves together through athletics, through business, through, again, clubs, or through drug abuse. We have taken the natural form of community that no one ever questioned. For the most part, during the history of Europe up until the 19th century, you would be born, live, and die within usually 20 miles of your birthplace. And you might travel to a big village on market, but that would be it. You never traveled outside your country unless you were in the military.
But that didn't have good results there either.
That what?
Did not have good results.
No, I'm not talking about results. I'm talking about the world in which we live. Okay? I'm not saying that what we had was good or what we have is good. What we had versus what we have, this is not a value judgment, it's just a statement, this is where we are. The vast majority of people that we meet have been themselves atomized. They are no longer living anywhere near their parents or their grandparents. Their ethnicity is going to be mongrel, probably, in the United States. I'm not passing a judgment on this. It's just what happened. The results is a form of community with which our ancestors were familiar and stable for generations is gone. That form of community is gone. And what we have now is a communityless society, seeking to form its own communities in often illegitimate ways.
I work with a lot of people that are pretty young, and it's
Not like you.
well,
Okay.
I like my age, and they always point out the huge
Yeah,
family.
yeah.
Who have a huge connection.
Right,
But most of them, like, no connection.
right.
And they find connection, community and connection from just friendships that
Yeah.
they just find people to be friends with, basically. But there's just a huge difference between
They're seeking community. Okay, now this is actually a tremendous opportunity for the church. And I'm not passing judgment. This is just what has happened. Okay? Because of what has happened and because of the need to not be killing your neighbor or being killed by your neighbor, religion has played a progressively diminishing role in the lives of Americans. And that's true among Catholics as well as Protestants and Jews. Okay? All three groups, major religions, their religion as an influence in their daily life and their community has diminished generation after generation for the last 200 years. Does that make sense? To the point where, and we'll talk about this more next week, none of this is benign. None of this is harmless. It all has value or demerit. The old style was very oppressive and stifled human thought and led to an ease of being oppressed by the elite. I don't want to go back to that world. I read enough history to know. I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to the 1970s or any time before that, okay? I'm not nostalgic. I like the world and the time in which I live. But I also think it's important to recognize what we paid for that. Because we did pay. We do not have that stability of community. And what we have in its place is tremendous stress, angst, fear. Because the world is not a stable place for us anymore. The smallness of the world, the ability of seemingly backwards Middle Eastern Muslim extremists to hijack a plane and bring down 2 huge towers in New York City. That is unnerving. And through the Cold War, the realization that our enemy could end our life any day and we could end theirs. And we could end the world in which we live through our nuclear power. That was destabilizing. Our lives are not, and I'm talking not just Christians, I'm talking about Western civilization is not a stable place anymore. Okay? So, drug abuse, alcoholism, psychiatric medicine, and psychiatric therapy have become multi-billion-dollar industries. Why? Because we've lost our center. Now, I would maintain that the center we once had was false. But it was more stable. It was a center. Whether it was family, and family was usually community and related. Okay? I'm reading a biography of James Madison. Okay? And she just listed all of the different families, the Randolphs, the Taliaferros, all these different they were cousins. So when you went to Philadelphia as James Madison and going to Congress, you met your cousins. Okay? And so that even at that time, there was more, even growing up in an Italian-oriented family, we knew our cousins. Didn't care for them all that much, but we knew them. We don't really have that anymore. So we have exchanged a community, a human society that had a recognizable centripetal force to one that now has centrifugal force with no discernible center. Okay? Does that resonate with anyone? Anyone disagree with that?
No, it wasn't good then either.
I'm not saying it was good or bad. Okay?
So we lost it. That means.
Okay, but that means the world in which we live is not the world in which our parents lived. Okay, that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's good or bad. What I'm saying is that we live in a time where humanity in the West has lost that centripetal force of society. How we respond to that is important, I think. Important to know, why is our culture so angst-ridden? Why is it so frenetic? Why is it so high stress? This is why. Okay? This is not a process of passing judgment either on the past or the present. It's simply a process of trying to understand our times that we might know what Israel is to do.
The old forms of connection seem to pop up as affinities in this new way of doing things too, which I find personally confusing. I don't know if I'm alone in that, but religion, even so-called Christian religion, pops up, but it's affinity based. It isn't like they're being connected to something of the past so much as they are chasing something to make them feel better. Same thing with family. I mean, the late the incidence statistically of later childbirth and things like that suggests that even family is being chased more as an affinity than as anything else. Does that resonate in the where you're going?
It does. This whole process has, we don't have the time to lecture on Immanuel Kant and his influence, but the idea that reality is determined entirely through sensory perception, which means that what is real is what I think is real, has created a universe full of little universes. We each become our own center, our own universe. And so, those things that used to mean the survival of our race are now optional, purely optional. Okay? The things, and I guess that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that everything was rosy. Please don't misunderstand me. The old world was not rosy. Infant mortality was horrendous. Life expectancy was, I'd be dead by now. I love what we gain from all of this, but our world isn't rosy either. Okay.
Seems like, at least impressionistically, the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church are some of the fastest growing.
They're the fastest growing.
Because they give the impression, at least, of being pre all of this.
Right.
And people are reacting against it.
Yes, and Protestants are also leaving in droves back into the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Church because of the sense of stability. What I'm saying is if you're living in a world that has lost its center, you're still dealing with human beings that need a center. Okay, we still need to fill that vacuum that the atheist has taken away in God. We need to fill that community that the Industrial Revolution has taken away and put into a polyglot city. We still need that, okay? But what's happening is that vast swaths of humanity, especially in the West, are synthesizing. They are creating makeshift communities and makeshift meaning. This is a tremendous opportunity for the truth of Jesus Christ. A tremendous opportunity for the church. Because when we turn to Paul, we will realize that the church is the new community of God. And yet its center in Jesus Christ is, as Paul calls it, the truth as it is in Jesus Christ. So if we try to address the world in which we live as if it were the world of the 17th century or the 5th century or whatever, we're not sons of Issachar. But when we go out in the world, we're often disoriented because there's nothing to grab hold of. You ever notice that? When there's nothing to grab hold? Well, that's what I'm trying to explain. I'm trying to explain why there's no longer anything to grab hold of is because we've jettisoned all of those things, whether good or bad, but those things that we had in common. And now we find we don't have anything in common with anybody. And so we go to social media, where we can be friends with actually not contacting anyone. But everything is kept positive because we're so angst-ridden and stressed out that we can't stand anybody disagreeing with us. Okay? This is the world in which we live. But it's not benign. It is actively evil. as it always has been, but we are to be aware of Satan's schemes. And that's all I'm trying to do, is say things have stayed the same to a large extent, but there is a definite uniqueness in our society that Paul did not experience, nor has any other generation up until the last 150 years. Jenny.
Last week you talked about various views of the church and the world, and you said that the problem with each of these views is that our battle isn't with or for or against the world, it's against the principalities of darkness. I feel like Paul shifted our focus when he said it's not like pre-industrial revolution where you had Jews and Gentiles. It's the world shut up under damnation and the kingdom of God.
Right. Yeah. We have to have a biblical perspective as we face any generation. And no generation, and I started out with it, no generation got it right. So our generation is wicked and perverse, as was Paul's. I'm simply saying that the wickedness and the perversion of our generation is, in many respects, unique. And it is wisdom to recognize that. Lauren.
I wonder if that has anything to do with almost the option of growing our own food and that occupying like most of the time of people. So now a lot of people have a lot more free time. And boredom should be kind of giving more time and thought to the wickedness that can, like the activism that we, I wonder if
Well, prosperity, yeah, does it give us more time to prosperity has always given people time to think about and to write about and to act against or for what they perceive to be evils. You mentioned growing our own food. One of the reactions to the loss of community and the recognition of the atomization of society, especially among Christians, has been to try to return to a pre-industrial, agricultural, and even cloistered world. That's the nostalgia that I don't think is the right way. I don't think going back to a time when we, for example, I'm out of time, but I don't believe that that there is wisdom in throwing away the advances that we have gained providentially through the scientific and industrial revelation. I don't want to give up the freedom that I owe under God, but I owe to the Enlightenment philosophers, okay, to their writings and the impact that their writings had on men who risked their fortunes and their lives to put aside a monarchy and to try to develop a republic. Okay, that was great. And you know, I don't want to give up the FDA, even though I think they're often really overboard. But you know, I have 3 children that have lived to adulthood. Okay, John Owen had 11, and they predeceased him. He outlived them all. I don't want to go back to that. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't want to go back to a pre-industrial, pre-enlightenment world because we have gained so much. But it's also not wise to not recognize what we lost while we were gaining. Okay? And I'll close with that. Father, we do ask that you would give us wisdom and cause us to dig into your word because we know that your word is truth. Sanctify them, Jesus said, in truth. Your word is truth. We pray that you would do this, that you would indeed renew our minds. Help us to be the sons and daughters of Issachar in our time, to understand the times and to know